Good morning. So we can kick this event off. This is a series of seminars on 5G and health that we are organizing. And I have a few slides just to give you some context and also some more details about the event before we start with our speakers. So let me see if I can switch the slide. Excellent. So just to explain how we came to organize this event. I don't know if you're aware, but in June 2019, there was a call for 5G projects, which was organized by the Department of Media, Telecommunications and Digital Policy. SnT submitted 2 proposals, and we were lucky enough that the 2 projects were awarded. The research groups that are involved is SICOM, ARG, and SpaceR. And of course, we submitted the proposals along with our strategic partners, Post, Proximus, and SES. In the proposals, we had various topics going from network planning to drones and mobile edge. Now, of course, to be able to execute these projects, we need infrastructure, we need 5G infrastructure. So the plan is to install mobile communications site on top of the JFK building. This is going to be installed and operated by Post and Proximus, and there's going to be both 4G and 5G capabilities. And just to clarify that here of 5G, we're talking about the C-band, the 3.5 gigahertz, and not the millimeter waves, which are still under discussion, at least in Luxembourg. Then the motivation for this infrastructure is obviously to enable SnT to run experiments, and we have a series of experiments either communicating with drones or measuring, taking measurements of the site through drones. And of course, the audience here is very wide, so I won't go into technical details, but I just wanted to set up the scene for this project.
So Simos disappear. I think he will come back. Nicola, can you take the lead of the presentation, perhaps? So it looks like not to be our day. So what I will propose, we will start the presentation for Luca. Luca will make you presenter that you can share your screen.
Okay, perfect. So yes, to stay safe, to stay safe, I will not activate my webcam. I will activate it during the question and answer session. And I'm going to share my screen as soon as you give me the presenter role.
Yes, Simos is back.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. So
Simos.
I think there is some issue with WebEx today. Second time that I got disconnected, but okay. I don't know. Did you manage to get what I was saying?
Not me.
Did you manage to catch any of the slides that I was presenting or not?
No, I was disconnected as soon as the registration of the event started.
Okay, all right. So I will share again and start from scratch then. Magali, can you give me again the presenter role? Excellent.
It's done.
It seems other people have problems with the WebEx as well, as I see from the chat. Let's give it another go. Can you see the slides now?
Now, yes.
Yes.
Okay. Excellent. I would suggest that everyone disconnects the video just to make sure that there is not a bandwidth problem with WebEx. But then I will kick off the event. I will start from scratch. I actually went through half of my slides, but I was disconnected. So let's go from the beginning. So the context of this series of seminars is the fact that in June 2019, there was a call for projects, for 5G projects by the Department of Media, Telecommunications and Digital Policy of the government of Luxembourg. And there were two projects that were awarded to SnT. The research groups that are involved with SICOM, ARG, and SpaceR. And of course, this was done in collaboration with our strategic partners, Post, Proximus, and SES. All of them are network operators, Post and Proximus on the terrestrial side and SES on the satellite side. The topics that we are investigating in these two projects have to do with network planning, drones, and mobile edge computing. Now, of course, to be able to carry out these projects, there is a need for infrastructure. And this is what initiated this mobile communication site on top of JFK, which is planned to be installed and operated by Post and Proximus. There's going to be both 4G and 5G capabilities. And here we're focusing on the C-band, so lower frequencies, 3.5 gigahertz, and not on the millimeter wave frequencies, which is important to clarify. Of course, this site would be needed to allow us to run experiments, and we plan a series of experiments. And without going into too many details, we're going to try communications with drones and, of course, measurements of the site performance through drones as well. Now, the purpose, of course, which is very important of this seminar, is a bit to highlight aspects related to 5G and health. Of course, it's a very complicated and interdisciplinary topic where there are engineers, biologists, and regulators involved. And we try to cover all aspects in this series of seminars. But of course, it's also a very sensitive topic because there is a lot of disinformation about it. And if you have seen the news, especially in the UK, there were even physical structure towers that were being damaged because of certain conspiracy theories. And that pushed the European Union even to issue a joint call signed by 15 members of the Commission trying to fight the disinformation regarding 5G. And here on the bottom right, you can see from the Twitter, you see some people went as far as connecting 5G with the coronavirus. So it's very important to increase awareness overall, but also within UNILO and SnT. And this was the main motivation of organizing these seminars. And of course, the plan is not to tell you that everything is fine, there's nothing to worry about, but to give you the option to interact with some well-known experts, acknowledged experts in the domain, and to be able to address your concerns and pose some questions that will make you feel more comfortable about this. Now to introduce the experts that are going to speak, I will start with Ralph. So Ralph Baden is a biologist specialized in health issues in relation to buildings. He has been with a series of ministries within Luxembourg, starting with health, environment, and energy, where he's currently in charge of health issues in relation to indoor air quality and building. And he has been very prolific, and he has also written books and published documentary films on healthy buildings so far. Our second expert today is Luca Ciaraviglio. He's an associate professor at University of Rome, Tor Vergata. And he got his MSc and PhD both from the Polytechnic of Turin. He's a well-known academic in the domain. He has co-authored more than 140 publications, and lately has been focusing very much on this connection of 5G, radiation, and health aspects. So he's going to be talking about that today. Last but not least, we have some experts from our partners, Post and Proximus. Apologies for the titles and the photos. I got them from Google and LinkedIn, so if they're not up to date, apologies for that. So Glenn is a project manager at Post, and Paul is a Telco Evolution 5G program coordinator. And of course, we have Gilles, who is also head of telecom networks at Proximus. And they're going to join the panel at the end and also try to answer any questions that you might have. Now, before we kick this off, this is the agenda for today. Depending on how we progress with connectivity, we must start with Luca first. The title of the talk is Health Risk Associated with 5G Exposure, Viewed from the Communications Engineering Perspective. And then Ralph, who's going to talk about 5G, potential health impacts and precautionary approach in Luxembourg. In both cases, we plan 30-minute presentation and 15-minute Q&A session. And at the end, again, we're going to open the floor to questions to the entire panel, also the experts from the team, and we hope to finish by noon. Now, a couple of rules of engagement. So for your questions, we would prefer to wait till the end of the presentations. And then you can either write your question on the chat, or you can raise your hand, and then Magali will unmute you so that you can interact directly and pose your question. Of course, also to notify you that we are going to record this session after getting the approval of the speakers, of course. And this is because many of our staff members wouldn't be able to attend at this specific slot. So we want to give them the option to see the event even at a later date. So without further ado, I think we can start with our presentations. By the way, I'm Simeon Hatzinotas. I'm a full professor here at SnT, and here are my details. I'm going to be the PI for these two projects in case you need more information.
Sorry, Simeon, I thought that there are still some issue with the connection. For instance, Milos is typing on the chat that they lost you, but I could hear you, so I don't know if this is an issue only for Milos.
Okay.
So, in case any other people in the chat have similar problem, maybe they can type so that we are aware of that.
But I have Milos on the list, it's okay.
Okay, good morning. Can you hear myself? Can you see my screen?
Yes, Luca, yes.
Yes.
Okay, very good. So we can start also from my side. Just Let me try. Okay, so thank you first of all for inviting me to this seminar. I will briefly introduce the main aspect, the main news that were updated on 2020 about 5G health risk. Some of them were introduced by Professor Simeon. And in general, what I can say is that actually there is a diffuse feeling of suspect and fear that is associated with 5G exposure, because 5G exposure is linked to severe health effect. This, as already pointed out by Professor Simon, has led to several sabotage of tower, principally hosting pre-5G equipment, so typically 3G, 4G, in different countries in Europe. Apart from UK, there have been many sabotage also in France and also the Netherlands. Moreover, some countries have denied the installation of 5G base station in their whole territory. We are talking about countries not in Europe, outside Europe, like Jamaica and Papua New Guinea. And just to give you another example, in Italy, different cities basically promoted ban in order to stop the deployment of 5G network over the whole territory. But however, a recent national law has actually deleted such ban. So it's a picture pretty complicated. Now, the goal of this talk is to analyze the health risk of 5G exposure by adopting the perspective of communication engineering that is actually my background, because actually 5G communication engineering can be seen as a sort of glue to analyze the different disciplines that are involved in the assessment of the health risk of 5G. So these disciplines include, for example, medicine, biology, physics, law, and economics. However, it's impossible to be very detailed given the amount of time that I have. So I refer to the link that is reported below for a paper including much more detail about this topic, okay? And I will also put a link at the end of this presentation. So let us start, first of all, from the main allegation about health effects from 5G exposure. So we need, first of all, to correctly set up, correctly define what we are talking about, because actually the electromagnetic field exposure for radio frequency devices, so also including 5G devices, belong to a specific category that is called non-ionizing. And in particular, the waves that belong to this category do not have enough energy to remove the electron from the atom of the living cell. This is very important to be remarked because this makes the radio frequency radiation completely different to the radiation, for example, from X-ray and gamma ray, which is very harmful for Earth because it triggers the ionizing process. Okay, so this is the first observation. Then the second observation is about, given the fact that we don't have such ionization process, what are the main effects that can be seen from exposure from 5G devices, in general from exposure from radio frequency devices? Well, essentially there are two main categories. The first category are called, typically called thermal effect, and typically these effects are prevented by ensuring an exposure below the maximum EMF limit. And then the second category is called non-thermal effect, which include all, let's say, effects that may be observed with an exposure below the limit defined by load. But however, it's important to stress the fact that at the moment, a clear causal correlation between an EMF exposure below the limit defined by law and the emergence of health effect due to non-thermal condition has not been found so far, okay? This does not mean that we are completely safe, but this means essentially that the research for possible long-term effect is still ongoing. It's still something that should be continued, but at the moment there is no scientific proof that link together, for example, the development of very bad diseases like cancer and tumor and an exposure to EMF below the limit defined by law. if we consider the main health effect allegation, typically, these are reported in the figure on the left, typically these health effects are located in the head, in the chest, and also in the hand where we keep the smartphone. But we need also to consider the specific type of exposure from 5G, and we need to distinguish between exposure from base station with respect to the exposure from the smartphone. And this is sketched on the figure on the right. The exposure from base station tends to be, let's say, uniform over the body and overall very low. This is something that was observed out of previous technologies. This is something that is being observed also by recent studies that are measuring the MF from 5G base station. And it's important to remark this aspect. Base stations are not the main source of exposure, and in typical conditions, like for example, indoor condition, the exposure from base station is negligible. The real source of exposure is the smartphone. Why? Because the smartphone, despite the fact that it radiates a consistently lower amount of power compared to the base station, is kept at a very short distance. And the distance plays a great role in determining the level of exposure, so that in general, many studies in the literature already show that the smartphone represents the largest source of personal exposure. Other health effect allegations include some diseases that may be triggered due to very high level of radiofrequency exposure, but typically these diseases cannot be applied to 5G equipment operating below EMF limit. Then there are other controversial effects, which include, for example, a supposed impact on male fertility or a supposed impact on electromagnetic hypersensitivity, but their connection with 5G exposure is not scientifically proven. And finally, as you may know, there have been a huge number of fake theories which try to connect the spreading of coronavirus disease with the deployment of the 5G networks or supposed oxygen effect triggered by 5G exposure, but these theories are based on no scientific proof, no scientific theory, and therefore they belong to what is called pseudoscience, fake science. Now, if we consider the main relevant medical studies in the context of 5G communication, these studies are focused on the assessment of possible non-thermal effects, so typically long-term effect, and in general they focus on the observation of cancer and tumor. Now, we can categorize these studies in two big families. So clearly this is a very simplification of the field, which is very huge, but I want to just to bring your attention about some relevant studies in the context of 5G communication. In particular, the first category is formed by studies that focus on exposure condition to animals, so typically mouse and rats, and typically they test different exposure level in a laboratory environment. And the most, let's say, relevant studies in the context of 5G communication are the study from the National Toxicology Program Institute, which is an American institute, and the Ramazzini Institute study, which actually comes from Italy. However, it's important to stress one thing. Actually, both these two studies, first of all, have been somehow discussed by the main international organization. And basically, the international organization found that both these studies typically follow good practice conditions. So they typically do testing over a huge number of animals, over different exposure, over a huge amount of time. But that conclusion, let's say, do not prove any strong connection between, again, emergence of these long-term diseases and an exposure level that can be seen in reality. Actually, both these studies use exposure levels that are far above the limit defined by law. For example, the NTP used exposure levels that are above the limit that are defined by the International Commission on Non-Ionizing Radiation Protection, ICNIRP, and the Ramazzini Institute study also use a exposure level well above the limit that are ensured in many countries in Europe. Then the second big category of study are all the studies that instead observe the possible health effect to the population. And in this case, it does not mean that the population is, let's say, radiated intentionally. It means basically that, for example, there are surveys that are delivered to the population, and then in the survey, people are asked to note the level of exposure from the smartphone, how often do you use the smartphone, the duration of the call, etc., etc. So typically all these studies are referred to previous technologies up to 4G, but there are some relevant also to 5G. And basically all these studies did not found any causal correlation between, again, the emergence of these long-term diseases and the level of exposure. Now, I just want to introduce some basic concepts about the metrics, the regulation, the compliance assessment procedure that are relevant to 5G exposure. And in particular, I want to draw your attention, first of all, about the main metrics that are used to characterize exposure from 5G devices. The first metric is the electromagnetic field strength, which is typically used to measure the exposure from 5G base station up to gigahertz frequencies. So typically including also, for example, the frequencies of the base station that is going to be installed in your premises. The second metric is the power density, which is used to measure the exposure from 5G base station, 5G user equipment over all the frequencies. And then the third metric is the specific absorption rate, SAR, which is typically used to measure the level of exposure from 5G user equipment up to gigahertz frequencies. If we consider the main regulation that define the limit for the maximum EMF exposure, the main organization in this field are the ICNIRP, which is an international commission, the IEEE, and the Federal Commission on Communication, FCC, in the United States. I also mentioning the FCC because despite the fact it's a federal body, so it's a body that typically defines the limit in the United States, their limits are used also in many other countries in the America. Typically, this organization differentiate between whole body versus the localized exposure. So they define different sets of limits for the different exposure conditions. They also differentiate between limits that are that needs to be ensured for the general public, so for the population who is in generally unaware of the level of exposure, and typically these limits are pretty stringent. And then there are also limits that are defined for people who have to perform maintenance operation, for example, in close proximity to a tower, because in general, this limit may be pretty higher compared to the limit of the general public, because these people are typically aware of the level of exposure, and typically they perform the maintenance operation in a limited amount of time. Then the last feature that I want to point out is also another important aspect, because these guidelines also define the exposure time, so the time that needs to be used, that will be considered in order to compute the average value of the previous metric, and also for some metric also the mass, the reference mass. Just to give you an intuition, without going into the details of the number, this table reports the EMF strength limit for the different organization, for different version of the same organization, and in particular, the table reports the general public limit, the occupational limit, and the time that is needed to compute the EMF strength. So by summing the table, we can see that if we consider the latest version of the guidelines that are promoted by a different body, what we can see is that actually these guidelines from the different bodies are converging into a common set of limits. So if we analyze this from a very macro perspective, I can say, okay, the limit defined by international regulation are somehow pretty homogeneous. What happens when we want to see how these limits are applied in the world? So unfortunately here there are many differences because if we just focus on 5G base station exposure regulation, many countries still adopt the previous version of ICNIRP limit that are dated back on 1998. Some countries are going to update this limit to the ICNIRP 2020 regulation, and other countries still adopt the FCC 1997 limit. So these are countries that adopt limits based on international guidelines. Then there are other countries, including your country and my country, so Italy and Luxembourg, that adopt limits that are actually stricter than ICNIRP and FCC on the basis of a precautionary principle, okay? So basically, typically, these limits are not based on a scientific evidence, but the goal of this limit is to ensure an additional level of safety for the population, but we'll see in a while that this is becoming challenging when considering 5G communication, and in particular, when considering the impact on 5G exposure from the smartphone. And finally, there are other countries that do not adopt any limit at all. And for this country, typically the operator ensures the ICNIRP limit on a volunteer base. If we consider then the level of 5G deployment and the limits that are enforced in each country, well, actually the situation is pretty heterogeneous. So this figure reports with different color the level of 5G deployment and the limits that are enforced in each country. So for example, the country with dark green, so dark green color, are those countries that are deploying 5G networks and are enforcing a limit from international guidelines, like for example, ICNIRP or FCC. Then there are countries that are marked in dark red that are instead countries that are planning to install 5G base station, but they are enforcing limits stricter than ICNIRP and FCC. And you can see that these countries are located in different parts of the world. So for example, there is Chile in the South America, Canada in North America, many countries in Europe, and also many countries in the Far East. By the way, some countries have updated their regulation compared to this picture that was taken around 1 year ago. So, for example, Poland and Lithuania that are marked in this chart as dark red, meaning that they have been used limits stricter than ICNIRP FCC until 1 year ago. Now they are changed their regulation. They adopt international regulation, so ICNIRP based limit, and so the color now is dark green. Okay. Then the last observation is about the light blue color that is observed for those countries that are not installing 5G and are not enforcing any EMF regulation. So this country, you can see, are mainly located in Africa. Okay. Now, which is the impact of the EMF regulation that are stricter than ICNIRP FCC? Well, actually, the most trivial consideration is the fact that with this strict limit, it will be impossible to install 5G base station where they are really needed, so especially in urban zone where the user are located. And that could be something that the population may perceive as an advantage, but actually it has two big problems. So the first problem is a strong negative impact on the 5G services, and in particular, apart from throughput and latency problems, so it will not possible to ensure the KPI, the key performance indicator that are, let's say, promised by 5G. In many zones, and this already happened with pre-5G technology, this already happened with 4G in different countries of Europe, it's even not possible to provide the basic coverage. And so this is the first observation. So in many parts of the territory, it's not possible to provide the whole coverage, and that's a big problem. Second big problem, which is somehow also neglected, but is also very important, is the fact that if we cannot install 5G base station close to user, then their smartphone need to connect to other base stations that are far from them. And typically what happens in this condition is that the smartphone has to radiate a huge amount of power. And so the level of exposure from the smartphone will radically increase. It's going to radically increase. This is already proven considering the deployment of current networks. Again, consider the deployment of 4G. This is something that is happening in countries like your country and my country. So in the third part, I want instead to briefly introduce some consideration about the health risk of specific 5G feature. And first of all, I want to talk with you about MIMO and beamforming and their worries in terms of exposure. So MIMO means that basically we are considering a radiation system in which there are a huge number of radiative elements, then a system in which there are a huge number of radiative elements. This is fundamental to achieve the very high throughput that is promised by 5G. The second feature is beamforming, that is typically the focalization of the power, of the antenna power, of specific portion of territory. So this is typically wrongly perceived because actually the scientific evidence and in more detail, more recent work proved the exposure from 5G base station operating with MIMO and beamforming feature is actually in line and in many cases even lower compared to legacy technologies. And this is something that from the communication engineer can understand, because typically instead of radiating the power over the whole territory like what happened with previous technologies, 5G base station operating with MIMO beamforming allow to notably decrease the amount of wasted power of the territory and allow to use the specific amount of power that is needed to serve each user. And so these have two main consequences. The first one is the fact that if we want to verify if a given 5G base station can be installed or not in a given territory, we have to use what are called statistical exposure model. So models that are able to capture the variation of power over space and over time that is typically of 5G base station operating under MIMO beamforming. Then the second big novelty is about the measurement of exposure level. And I'm happy to know that you have a project that is considering also this aspect, because the measurement of the exposure from 5G base station it becomes a very extensive task, which requires to to measure the level of exposure over different locations and over multiple times. Then the second aspect that is important to be discussed is 5G densification. 5G densification means that we need to install a huge number of 5G base stations over the territory, and basically it means that instead of having few base stations, each of them with a large coverage, we pass with a dense deployment in which each base station have a pretty small coverage. And so this actually is typically linked with, is typically believed to bring to an exponential increase of exposure, but actually the scientific evidence says the opposite, because by increasing the number of base stations, it's possible to reduce the coverage of this base station, and therefore it's possible to reduce the amount of power that is radiated by each base station. So the power radiated by the base station is not something that is invariant, is constant with respect to coverage size, but typically it's scaled with the coverage size. And so what happens is that with 5G densification, it will be possible to actually reduce the level of exposure. And in any case, even if I have not convinced you about this statement, I also stress the fact that the exposure from 5G base station, even in the presence of 5G densification, needs to always adhere to the limits defined by law. Then the third big aspect is about the adoption of frequencies in the millimeter wave. First of all, we need to point out that the biological effect from millimeter wave have been studied in the past, although for different contexts, because, for example, millimeter waves were used to in some body scanner deployed in the airport and in some other military application, while their usage for pervasive communication is something that is relatively new. In this context, many international organizations are considering, like the World Health Organization, are considering the review about possible health risk assessment or radio frequency exposure, including millimeter waves, and this survey will be completed by 2022, but it's important to stress the fact that the international limit, so international EMF regulation, already include the limit for millimeter waves. So the limits are defined even for frequencies above millimeter waves, up to 300 gigahertz. So this also prevents from any thermal effect and also integrates possible non-thermal effects that may be observed in the future. And finally, I want to stress the fact that the deployment of base station operating on millimeter waves is still not happening in many countries. Professor Simon already pointed out this aspect in Luxembourg, and I can say that it's precisely the same in Italy. And moreover, I need to stress another fact. Millimeter wave base station will be not deployed everywhere, will be deployed typically to serve hotspot zones, so zones where high capacity is needed. These include, for example, airport, shopping mall, train station, etc. But for sure, millimeter wave base station will be not deployed everywhere. And then the next aspect is about the connection of IoT devices. And we foresee the connection of millions of IoT devices in the same cell. And this may bring some worry for the population because they say, okay, I have a million of transmitting antenna. And so the level of exposure will be radically increased compared to the current situation. But actually, also here, there are some basic, let's say, evidence that can be applied. Because first of all, we need to point out that the current specification for IoT devices impose very low values of maximum transmitted power, because typically these devices are operating under battery limited conditions, so it's obvious that they are not transmitting a huge amount of power. And then the second observation is that actually propagation will play a great role, because these millions of IoT devices will be not attached to our body. They will spread over the cell, over the entire extent of the cell. And because the distance between these IoT devices and ourselves is not negligible, their level of exposure will be mostly negligible in many cases. And of course, the overall level of exposure will have to adhere to the regulation defined by law. Okay. So in the last part of this brief presentation, I want instead to tackle another important aspect, that is how we can somehow mitigate the perceived risk by reducing the level of exposure from 5G networks and beyond 5G networks. So this figure reports an overview of the possible techniques that can be used to reduce the level of exposure. And more in detail, there are techniques that can be developed at the device level. So, for example, considering the smartphones, so to consider user equipment, it would be useful to define methodologies to reduce the level of SAR by deciding where to place the antenna of the smartphone in order to reduce the exposure to the user. Or it will be also interesting to design base station, so radio equipment and electromagnetic field aware. Second big family is about techniques that can be applied in order to add new functionalities at the architectural level that allow to reduce the level of exposure. And these functionality include, for example, the application of large intelligent surfaces aided communications, vertical and horizontal densification, and network offloading. Then, considering instead network-based solution, so a solution in which the different network devices cooperate in order to reduce the level of exposure, one possible solution is the cellular planning with electromagnetic field aware target. And the second is the definition of allocation communication protocol that are already EMF aware. And finally, the last big family of work, tackle regulation, because regulator can do a lot in limiting the level of exposure. For example, it will be important to define this mission plan for legacy technologies, including 2G, 3G, and 4G. Just to give you another point, in Italy, operators are going to shut down the 3G networks in favor of 5G. The second big aspect is the fact that we should go into a common view about regulation, and we should harmonize the exposure regulation, possibly by adopting the international guidelines, and possibly by adopting a clear assessment of compliance procedure also for 5G devices. The third big task that can be done is the reduction of emission from non-cellular radio frequency sources, which include, for example, radio and TV repeaters. And finally, the last task is about the pervasive EMF measurement and the integrated EMF reporting system, which would clearly show to the population that the exposure level from the base station are overall very limited. This figure reports then a possible future scenario which integrates 5G and beyond 5G functionalities. The small figure on the left reports the current situation pre-5G, in which the base station tends to radiate in different portions of the territory, and in which we have also some microwave link for backhauling, which tends to contribute to the level of radiation, including the sensitive area in the center of the small figure. The figure on the right reports instead the same scenario, but by adopting a new cellular network in which the base station implement MIMO and beamforming in order to, let's say, exposure, radiate only the user that required the service, and also the exploitation of intelligent reflective surfaces in order to reach user without the need of exposing too much the sensitive area in the middle. So in conclusion, what I can say is the following. The health concern about the deployment of 5G base station are not supported by the evidence from our analysis. And so there is no compelling motivation to stop the deployment of 5G networks. Of course, this is something that I want to stress also in this presentation. It's important to continue to research possible long-term health effect under realistic exposure pattern from 5G devices. And I stress this part, so it's very important to consider testing conditions that are meaningful, okay? And finally, of course, it would be advisable to continue the research and to design exposure-aware cellular networks for 5G and beyond 5G properly. So this concludes my talk. I leave my contact and also the link to download the detailed paper. Okay. I'm also going to stop the sharing. And I think that we can start with the question and answer session.
Thank you very much. This was a very interesting presentation. So now we would like to open the floor to questions. As we discussed, there are two ways. You can either raise your hand and then Magali will unmute you, or you can write something on the chat and then we will try to address the question.
Konstantinos, it's okay for you?
May I ask?
Yes.
Am I allowed? Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Professor, for the interesting talk. I'm wondering about something, I mean, based on your experience. What does it take in general, actually, to convince the governments to start deploying 5G infrastructure? I mean, up until now, as you presented, several of them, also in Europe, they are a bit reluctant. So is it that they are waiting to see actually scientific facts, or several of them go with a common stereotypes that at some point, I mean, from one side, we have an increased number of antennas when talking about massive MIMO. Also, we have an increased number of base stations when talking about densification. So is it that the scientific evidence will convince them actually, because I mean, currently we have some evidence. It's not necessary to wait for long actually, and if it's still actually, if you think that it's quite difficult actually to convince them actually, what would it take in terms of general, let's say, composition, let's say, of the let's say of the assembly that decides about it? About this, we would need more, let's say, technical people on the board actually, and not so many bureaucrats. So this is what I'm interested in to get to know about. Thank you.
Yes, I understood the question. You touched a very interesting aspect. I agree with you that in many countries in Europe, the deployment of 5G networks, so the installation of 5G base station, is something that it's somehow on late. But this is something that it's also a political choice. I agree with you that we should have more people with the right background inside let's say, the ministries and inside all the places where these decisions are taken. And of course, at the moment, the installation of 5G is something that is seen with suspect and fear for the population, for the not a negligible amount of population, and this is something that may also affect the political choices, because of course, if I am a politician and I need to somehow considering what my voters like or do not like, of course, we have an issue, because if we have a huge amount of people that are firmly convinced that 5G is dangerous, 5G is not useful, 5G is linked with economic interest, then my voters will not vote myself if I take this decision. But I believe that the politicians should go over this, should really look at a wider time scale, because with 5G we could really solve even many long-term issues and also many problems that we had even with the pandemic. So this is also an advice that we need to go to really see with a long-term view, not just looking at the short-term view. But of course, it's very difficult. So just to give you another intuition, another fact, in Italy, we had a slight change in the regulation governing the exposure, regulating the exposure. So basically, the introduction of a sort of deterministic, not deterministic, but a kind of parameter in order to allow the installation of more base stations inside the territory. And this small change inside a regulation that was conceived more than 20 years ago was done only by, let's say, a government, a technical government, okay? Not the other government that instead were voted by the population did not change at all this regulation. This stresses the fact that it's very difficult, but it's something that I can see is happening in other countries in Europe. So, for example, Poland had a very nice change on this side because until around 1.5 years ago, they had one of the most stringent exposure regulation in the world. Then they have studied together with technical parties, together with operators, together with people working on the medical evidence. They have then turned this regulation, they've changed it, and now they have voted ICNIRP guidelines. So this is something that is possible to be done. But of course, I agree with you that it's something also very, very challenging, okay?
It's okay to talk, Konstantinos.
Thank you very much for the answer. It was very comprehensive. Thank you.
Thank you.
Any further questions? If not, maybe I can pitch one just to get Luca's opinion. So, I mean, obviously nowadays everybody has a very easy way of stating their opinion due to the social media and so on. So what do you think is the responsibility of academics such as ourselves in terms of reaching out to the public and trying essentially to dissolve certain misinformation that might be out there? Of course, a few years ago this was not an issue because the information dissemination was much more centralized and controlled. But now it's very I would say decentralized. So maybe this gives also some higher responsibility or new tasks to us to be able to engage more actively with a wider audience.
Yes, I believe that this could be a task for ourselves that work in academia. This is something that should be done with a strong effort, in my opinion. So social media have completely changed the way we really see the news. For example, we read the news, we know about each other. So it's a very powerful way to connect people. But I believe that it has also some issues. So, for example, all these theories that are against 5G are very appealing, in my opinion. So typically, you can find a small post with very, very appealing word, with very appealing phrases. So I think that we need also to work a lot on this side from academia, because, of course, classically, we are more engaged in publishing paper in technical venues, but it's important to increase our load also in this activity. So promoting the scientific research only over the social media. This is something that we need to go. And another important aspect is the fact that people typically read these fake theories, but they are not controlling at all the sources. So they are not controlling at all the veridicity of these claims. And this is another important point for which I don't have an answer, because this is a serious issue. So actually nowadays everyone can put a phrase over the internet, and if this is appealing, it has a huge number of followers, but typically people are not controlling the sources. So in this, I am pretty worried considering this last aspect. And again, I believe that we should do more also from our side.
Thank you. I see there is maybe we take one last question and then we move on and we cover the rest of the questions at the end, just to keep with the schedule.
It's yes. One additional question from Usin.
Yes, thanks, Magali. Thank you, Professor Luca. I have just one question about the limitation. So this, we know that the exposure of the EMF exposure to the human body is difficult to have measured effect on it. So what is this limit? The basic of this limitation is based on theoretical or experimental study? And what is the level of the confidence to these limitations?
So the idea of these guidelines is to analyze all the literature, including the studies from the medical and biology field, and to set up limits that are much lower compared to the values of exposure that trigger thermal effect. So the idea is that they define a limit that prevent the thermal effect, but these limits are way lower, order of magnitude lower compared to the typical exposure that trigger thermal effect. That's more or less the motivation, the main rationale behind the guidelines. So there is evidence, okay? So there is the evidence, and typically what happens is that this main organization nicely overviewed all the scientific papers that analyze the thermal effect, and in this specific topic, of course, the literature is very huge. Because there are many people working on this side. And moreover, they are also observing, they're also analyzing all the literature about the non-thermal effect, okay? And when they define the limit that varies with respect to frequency, they consider, of course, the works that investigate the thermal effect. And for those frequencies for which there are not yet available works studying thermal effect, they apply also interpolation techniques in order to set up the limit also for the value. Interpolation techniques that are applied between, for example, two frequencies that were instead analyzed by scientific works.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, excellent. Thank you very much, Luca, and hopefully you can stay with us for the last part of the discussion in case there are additional questions.
Okay. Thank you.
Now we can pass on to our next speaker, which is Ralph Baden. Ralph, can you hear us? I see you're not muted now, but maybe there is an issue with your audio because we cannot hear you. Right?
And you are presenter now, Ralph. You can share your presentation too.
So in the meantime, we try to make the connection work with Ralph. Maybe we can also take a 5-minute break for anyone that wants to pop out for a while, and then hopefully in the meantime we'll try to connection.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, perfect.
Excellent.
Okay, just give me 1 minute. You still hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. I hear you.
Take as much time as you need, Ralph,
okay.
because we can take like a short break, also 5-minute break here.
Okay,
so,
no problem. I have.
No, we're not in a hurry.
I have my computer where I can see you and you can hear me, but I can hear you on my laptop. So I'm switched on twice. But better than nothing. Okay, that will be a little bit more difficult for the good questions.
But we can hear you very well, though.
Okay, I tried something else. Just give me 1 minute. Can you still hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I can hear you on the second device. So this will be for the question. I will have a return of my own voice. But anyway, I will manage. Last thing is to try to move on with the.
We try to put the presentation in the code as well.
Okay, now I'm okay. And just try working on the two laptops in parallel, which might be a little bit complicated, but okay, it's okay. I will manage. Sorry for that.
No worries.
Okay, so I'm ready whenever you want.
And I think we still see part of your screen is blocked by another window. I don't know if you can minimize it.
Or if you can try to go full screen with the presentation, this should solve the issue.
Like that?
Yeah, maybe you can move outside of the slide, this little rectangular window.
Yeah, I think now it's better.
Okay.
Thank you.
Right, so
there we are.
Is in order. So Ralph, please feel free to start whenever you like.
Okay, everybody's back. I can start.
Yes, please go ahead.
So thank you for inviting me, first of all, and thank you to Luca for switching and helping me out of this little trouble. Okay, I was supposed to stay here for a while. Okay, so I'm a biologist. I have been working for the Ministry of Health for almost 20 years, where I was responsible for measurements within the indoor air quality and pollution problems linked to people having troubles. And I switched over first to the Ministry of Environment and then to the Ministry of Energy, because there was a new direction created about sustainable and healthy construction, which is now what I'm working for. Now, to start, we have to know that there is a lot of confusion and a whole mess about thousands of studies that cannot really be being mixed up and compared. We are mixing up biological effects with diseases, long-term, short-term effects, thermal versus non-thermal effects, and this being done with a lot of different applications, including a lot of different frequencies and a lot of different kind of studies on cell cultures, on animals, as Lucas said, mainly rats and mice, on humans, epidemiology, where again we have all kind of, so there's a lot of mess and confusion, and I think before coming to 5G, we should put a little bit of order into this confusion to start with. Now, electromagnetic fields, it's about waves, and I would start with another wave, which is the sun or light. And here we have tan bathing, which is well known. And we perfectly know that there is a difference if I'm going out in the sun in Luxembourg or, for instance, in Lanzarote. So it's a difference in the exposure. If I go out for 30 minutes or 4 hours, it's about time. If I go out at noon or late in the afternoon, it's about the dose of light that I'm getting exposed to. Whether I'm a kid or an adult, it's about vulnerable groups. And whether I have dark or pale skin, it's about the individual sensibility or susceptibility. This is all about the dose that can be very different from one situation to another one. And then if we look at the health issue, we might have psychological effects. We all know that we are lacking sun right now, which is leading some people into depressions. So we have a benefit in terms of a psychological effect. We do have physiological effects like heating. It's warm when we get out, and if the sun is not there, we are freezing. Biological effects like the production of vitamin D done by the skin, which is also a benefit because it helps our immune system. And then we have negative effects on the other side, like a sunburn, which would be a short-term effect with only temporary outcome. Can be even go further into a heat stroke, which would be an acute effect, which would be a disease, could even be fatal, killing us. and long-term chronic effects, diseases like skin cancer. So we have a lot of different effects compared to different doses, and this makes the complexity of waves, and it won't be different with electromagnetic fields. Now, we know sun very well and the effects of the sun very well because we are exposed over centuries and centuries. Now imagine that the sun was there only 10 to 20 years. So we would not now have the feedback to tell you all these consequences which I have described so far. And this is what actually happens with mobile phone or with RF in terms of communication. This is what happens with 4G and which will continue to happen, of course, with 5G. If we look at different effects, we start with thermal effects, which are very well known, which are a lot of different biological effects, like changes in body fluids, like change in protein synthesis. But most of these effects are also observed during physical effort, and we are all aware that physical effort will not be an unhealthy effort. So our body has thermoregulation mechanisms, so there is body response. So thermal effects being there does not automatically mean that they must hurt us, must be negative effects. These thermal effects are basically accepted by ICNIRP for putting out the limits, which are officially and legally binding throughout Europe, or even more, adopted by the European Commission and also by WHO, the World Health Organization. But we must also know, that you still hear me? Hello?
Yes, we can still hear you.
Okay. But we must also know that ICNIRP is a private organization, and there is actually a report in the European Parliament by Michel Rivazini, who is criticizing ICNIRP. And then we come to the non-thermal effects, where there are a lot of studies, and I would like to go through some of these studies which are repeatedly used for people who are against 4G and 5G to argue that there is harm, or that there might be harm. The first one was the REFLEX program back in 2003, led by 12 groups in 7 European countries. And they exposed cells. Those were human cells, but human tumor cells, the HL60 cells. So they exposed them to a continuous wave of RF for 24 hours. What you see on the picture is in the middle, looking like a sun. The sham, it's a negative control. You see, what is colored or lightning is DNA, which is all together within the nucleus of the cell. On the right side, you have the same picture with the positive control, which is an irradiation, a radioactive irradiation, and you have like this comet tail on the right side. Those are single and double strand DNA breaks, which then could be a first step into tumor building. And on the bottom of the slide, you have the RF exposed cells, and you see that there is also a comet tail. So this would say that there might be, due to exposure to RF, there might be breaks within the DNA. The limitation is, although those are human cells, they are tumor cells, and they are in cultures. So we are talking here about cell experiments, and they are not, these single cells are of course not secured by complex defense mechanism as they are within our body. So the extrapolation from a cell experiment to the body might be sometimes adventurous. Now you are obviously I don't know why you are seeing two pictures now.
Yeah, there is a box in the middle, on top middle. Okay, now it's reduced. Okay.
Yes, but you are seeing. Okay.
Now
so going on with non-thermal effects, there is a Salford study in Sweden at the same time, which was done on rats, which were exposed by a single GSM exposure for 2 hours, and then they were killed after 50 days. And there was a dissection of the brain with antibodies against albumin, which is a protein normally present in the blood, but not in the brain. You see on the bottom picture A, which is the control group, where you do not find the albumin within the brain. And in the exposed group, picture B, you see some coloration due to albumin, which obviously passed the blood-brain barrier and was found back in the brain. This is, of course, a biological effect and not the disease itself, but the opening of the blood-brain barrier might open a way to chemicals like mercury, biocides, and solvents to get into the brain and to become harmful. So again, this is an effect, a biological effect, which could be the start for a disease, but it's not the disease itself. And maybe there might be some differences for the individual susceptibility of people because of a mix of a cocktail of exposure. Now, again, the critics here is that this was an exposure for rats to the same GSM phone that we have when we phone. But of course, the dose is completely different because a rat has less body weight. The same dose or the same exposure compared to less body weight will give a completely different dose, of course. Two recent studies that Luca mentioned also back in 2018, again on rats and mice, was the NTP study in the United States and the Ramazzini study in Italy. And they both found a significant increase of different types of tumors, astonishingly, amazingly, more significant for male rats than for females. The Polish Ministry of Digital Affairs commented these studies, saying again that the dose for a rat to a usual GSM exposure is completely different compared to humans. So the extrapolations to humans is questionable. And the challenge will be in aiming at defining a safe range, actually. Before I come to the next study, I have to emphasize on something that we call EHS, electrohypersensitivity, which is recognized by WHO and which seems to be that some people express different symptoms when they are exposed to EMF, to electromagnetic fields. This is recognized, as I said, by WHO. The prevalence, there is a very wide range, but according to different studies, might be between 2, 3, or 4% of the population, which would be the most sensitive people compared to electromagnetic fields. This is important as for the next study, which was done by Dominique Belpomme, a cancer specialist in Paris. And he identified biomarkers within our blood characterizing this EHS pathology. Like those biomarkers are very diverse, like histamine and IgE, which is signs of allergies, oxidative and nitrosative stress markers, autoantibodies, vitamin D, and heat shock proteins, which would increase as well as also the S100B protein, which is a protein that is found in brain dysfunction pathologies. Now, what is interesting here is that he exposed EHS patients, and 2 hours after the GSM use, he found an increase of this protein for brain dysfunction. But on the other side, he exposed non-EHS patients, like normal population, and they did not show this increase of this protein. So this shows actually that there might be only this vulnerable EHS group reacting to EMF exposure or to RF exposure, and most of the people would not. And this brings us to the hypothesis that only a minority of sensible vulnerable group, which is only about 2, 3, 4% of the population, might be sensitive, whereas all the other populations, the majority, would not react. There has been by Martin Paul a theory explaining a possible mechanism involving voltage-gated calcium channels, but there again, those would lead to nitrosative stress and then to oxidative stress. But we know that this mechanism also plays a role in every numerous physiological functions, including nerves, muscle cells, and so on. And on the other side, we observe this voltage-gated calcium channels opening also in stress reaction, not involving EMF. So the question is this specific to EMF, or is it maybe a stress reaction and EMF is able to induce stress, which then again would not be a specific mechanism. The problem with this theory is that it was developed out of a review of 26 studies. Those 26 studies involve calcium channel blocker drugs and the effects on human cells, but in vitro, and on animals, and not on humans in vivo, and not without blocker drugs. So here, and the other problem is that it involved low frequency fields and not RF. So there are a lot of limitation to the theory, which still is not a common theory and not accepted by everybody within the scientific world so far. In terms of epidemiology, on studies, on observation studies on humans, there has been in 2010 published the Interphone study, which lasted a couple of years and which was important because there was some information in the direction of neurinoma or glioma cancers, which are rather rare, not so often. But there seems to be limited evidence for humans as well for animals in experience for carcinogenicity. This study was important in terms that the study conducted to the classification by WHO or by IARC into the group 2B, possible carcinogenic to humans. Two other epidemiologic recent studies, one done in Austria, including 17 different studies on health effects. And this was a combination of double-blinded studies, of experimental and unblinded studies, and on field studies. The outcome was quite different. No effects for the double-blinded studies, but clearly significant effects, including discomfort, anxiety, and tensions in unblinded studies and also in field studies. Now, the conclusion of this, it suggests a nocebo effect, since the field studies and unblinded studies showed some effects that were not confirmed in double-blind experimental studies. So seems to be nocebo effects, but they are so consistent and striking that they should, however, be taken into account. And of course, the limitation is that long-term effects are not possible to be studied in double-blind experiments because of technical aspects. The other one was a study involving 6,000 participants in the Netherlands. And here there were a lot of questionnaires and then also modeling of exposure. The outcome was very interesting in terms that there seemed to be a consistent association between self-reported outcomes and perceived exposure, but not with modeled RF exposure. So here you see clearly the subjectivity of the outcome. And on the other side, there was a clear difference between EHS patients and normal populations. There was significant difference, for instance, for GSM exposure and ear symptoms for the group of electro-hypersensitive persons with an odds ratio close to 2 compared to non-sensible persons. So here again, there might be either a nocebo effect or a minority of indeed electrosensible persons. Now, all this is, and we have to be clear about this, this was about 2, 3, and 4G. Now, 5G is something new in terms of technology. There will be more antennas, but these small nearby cells will have less power, as Luca said, less power for the base station, but also for the personal device. I will come back on this in a moment. There will be similar frequencies, but also higher frequency. 3.6 gigahertz will be higher than 2.4 or 2.6, even if often compared to, and the millimeter wave will be even higher. And we have to know that the higher the frequencies are, the better the shielding of walls or of any obstacles, so they would not go as deep inside the buildings. And on the other side, the higher frequency will also less penetrate within the skin, so there will be a better protection against higher frequencies. On the other side, there will be IoT, which will provide more data transfer, but very short data, not voluminous. And there will be, of course, beamforming, which allows a heterogeneous exposure pattern, both in space and time, which we did not have so far with 2G, 3G, or 4G. And it was, as Luca confirmed for Italy, but we know it also for Germany, that there will be replacement. 3G will be switched off to allow 5G. So there might be substitution of different frequencies by other one, and this is the big question mark, in which way 5G will be added to the existing exposure or substitute and replace. Finally, what we have to know is that the main exposure today is not from base stations, but is from the individual devices. And this, I think, is also a new aspect. Smartphones are working different than handies did. I will come to this in a moment. Now, going back to what does exist in terms of studies so far, as the French National Agency for Sanitary Security said a year ago, that the specific studies on 5G are still missing. Extrapolation is possible, but limited, because 5G emissions might be higher, but short-term compared to the long-term exposure that we had with 4G so far. In terms of exposure value, it's very different to find any exposure data so far. There's a lack of data. There is even a lack of knowledge how to measure, since we have this time variation and this user variability, which makes it difficult to have just short-term measurement. Lack of interpretation of values. We will have short-term exposure compared to long-term exposure so far with 2, 3, and 4G. And of course, the limits of the recommendation values should then be rethought since short-term exposure will be different from long-term. What I could find was earlier this year measurements being done in Great Britain, you see on the right side, I don't have any pointer, sorry for that. So the 0.04 volt per meter, this would be the contribution of 5G at the maximum point in Birmingham, and the altogether value would not exceed 0.9 volt per meter as shown in London, Canary Wharf. Those values are far below the recommendation values of 3 volt per meter that we have in Luxembourg. And this 3 volt per meter, which is maybe an answer to the last question that was asked to Luca, the 3 volt per meter that we use, or that we have as a recommendation, not a limit, but a recommendation value here in Luxembourg, they result from the maximum, the electrocompatibility, which for electric appliances, which means that all your electric devices like washing machine and so on, they must be protected against higher values. So it's not a health issue, the 3 volt per meter, it's a precautionary recommendation value coming out from a technical point of view, but not from a healthy one. That was the only thing that was available back in time when these 3 volt per meters were adopted. But what we see from these exposure values, and this was confirmed by the speech of Luca, is that the contribution in terms of exposure by 5G seems apparently to be much below the existing recommendation values or limits. Now, if we look at the studies about the use of personal devices, we see that back in 2018, almost half of the teenagers were constantly online. This shows that the main exposure today, at least for teenagers, but it won't be different for adults, I'm afraid, is the personal device and not the base station. These are some measurements done in Germany. Sorry. So you have here the comparison of an old mobile phone handy in standby, where you see on the left, on the top of the picture, just an exposure every 4 hours, compared to the smartphone in standby modus on the right side, with no apps active, Wi-Fi inactivated, and you see there is a constant communication. Even if you don't use your smartphone, it communicates with the next base station. And of course, you have the exposure to the smartphone constantly. Bottom on the left side, you have a home with a couple with a 16-year-old girl, and you see overnight from 11 o'clock in the evening until the morning, you have a constant communication of those three smartphones with the base station, although the people are sleeping, but the exposure due to the smartphone is there. And finally, on the right side, the blue diagram, the blue peaks, show or compare the exposure close to a base station, but you have on the right side, you have these very small peaks which are due to the base station, and then on the left or in the middle of the picture, you have this very high peak above 100 dB microvolt, which was due to a smartphone. So you can see that clearly the exposure to smartphone is more important than the exposure to the base station. And this is the situation, Jens, and you can observe in the morning in the bus station or wherever. You are surrounded by a lot of smartphone antennas very close to you, much more closer than the base station, which is more or less far away. And knowing that the farther this base station is, the more the smartphone has to emit power to reach the cell. This, the other way around, means that the closer the base station is, the less the exposure, or the more the exposure to the smartphone will decrease. So this would be a clear recommendation into having more base stations, but closer to the actual activity. And on the other side, you see the speed of a movie download, which is, of course, one of the main things that young people are doing today with their smartphones. And you see that you can significantly decrease the time of downloading, which will then again decrease the exposure to the exposure time to my smartphone. So 5G in these terms might, due to this new technology, reduce the exposure to the smartphone. I think this is something we must also not lose out of the eyes and keep in mind within the discussion about 5G today. Nevertheless, there are a lot of different scientifics and experts appealing for the precautionary principle as long as we do not obviously know enough about long-term effects with a technology that is only 15 to 20 years old, at least in this. The precautionary principle, it's about thinking the unthinkable. So we have to prepare for surprises, including long-term effects, even if we don't know whether they will come or not. This is nothing else than what we did with COVID back in March or April this year. This precautionary principle with early warnings and a reaction due to the first signs or indication, and not waiting for hard scientific facts to arise because we are going to lose time. This was the approach we had with COVID, and this should be within a precautionary principle also the approach concerning 4G and now 5G. Now, the position of the Luxembourg government in the implementation of 5G is clearly about precautionary approach. That is what the government is trying to apply. We had it also already for the 4G with the 3 volt per meter recommendation, and at this stage there is no idea about changing this 3 volt per meter, so it should still be consistent also for 5G. There is a website being prepared by the government on EMF and also RF 5G, but not only 5G, with special focus on health issues. There has been, in case of 4G already, and this will go on, a monitoring continuous survey by the Administration of Environment, which is publicly, transparently and publicly on a website of Geoportal, where there is also public information accessible to the public on behalf of base stations and measurements. And there are, concerning 5G, a lot of pilot studies being started now and also in the future, with also always the health issues addressed. And there is even one of these pilot studies addressing only and exclusively the health issues. So as a conclusion, regarding 4G, we still have, and we will have for a long time, lack of scientific, decisive knowledge of potential health issues. A lot of studies so far are done on personal devices, on smartphones, and not on base stations. And then there is an extrapolation from one to another, which is always difficult, because with the personal device, we observe locally exposed brain, for instance, whereas for base station, we have a whole body exposure. So we are, again, as I said in the beginning of my speech, comparing apples and pears. A lot of potential interaction, vulnerable groups, and hence we do see that biological effects do exist. Now, these are biological effects. The next question will be, will they be able alone or in combination with other chemicals, for instance, be able to induce disease or not? Coming to 5G, we clearly have to say that most of the discussion that is done today is based on 4G and extrapolated to 5G, which is not completely correct because we observe differences in frequencies and technologies, probably in power intensity of long-term versus short-term exposure. We do have a lot of a lack of knowledge about the exposure intensity and time pattern. We do have a lack of information how 5G will be implemented. Will 3G be switched off? Will 4G be reduced? So will there be an adding or a substituting? And we have the effect, the benefit effect on the exposure from personal device being reduced by installing a more better coverage with antennas for 5G. Yet the government is taking into account potential health issue, applying the precautionary principle, and in my opinion, 5G could also be seen as a chance or an opportunity to reduce the so far 2G, 3G, 5G, 4G exposure. So maybe with installing 5G, we could even go a step back in terms of overall exposure. And I would end with the sun again. A little bit of sun these days might not be wrong. Life is not black or white. It's always a compromise that we have to do. Thank you for your attention.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Ralph, for the interesting presentation. It's nice to see different perspectives, since most of the times we talk to people of our own scientific community. But as we said, it's a very interdisciplinary topic, so it's good to see another point of view. So at this stage, I think we can open the floor to some questions. So as always, you can either use the chat or you can raise your hand.
So I have no hand.
Maybe I can break the ice a bit. So Ralph, my question is that obviously, being a biologist, this is a topic that you have to work with other disciplines as well. So how complicated it is to understand each other's point of view and to start speaking the same language when it comes to running experiments. We've seen from both presentations that there are many ways of many performance metrics that you could use to set the limits or interpret the results of the measurements. So how have you perceived this in your career? I mean, is it difficulty, or at the end we manage to make it work somehow?
I think that the first thing is, if you look at both presentations, which were maybe done by people coming from different parts of initial points, but in the end, I think that there was not so much difference in both speech. I was very pleased that that a lot of things that I had prepared in my speech had already been addressed in Luca's speech, and I think that the outcome finally is not so different from biologists compared to research or technologists. I think that 5G on the other side gives us the opportunity finally, and that's something I deeply welcome, that we finally join around the table and discuss the studies and the results, and finally we see that we have always been not so far away from each other, And I think this was what had never been addressed in 4G. I think the problem, and this is also why there is so much discussion about this 5G from my point of view now, is because the discussion that is done now in public and also within the specialists is the discussion that maybe should have been done years ago with 2G, 3G, and 4G. So we forgot at this time to be transparent and to discuss the issues, and now it is done. So I think that the ice between the ones and the other one is melting, and we see that we are all working on a common issue, and that the views might be a little bit different, but in the end, not so different.
Thank you very much. Any further questions from the audience?
Looks like no.
Okay, so maybe in that case we can also open questions to the entire panel. Before we do that, maybe I would like to give the opportunity to the colleagues from Post and Proximus if they want to say a few words about the different processes of installing a site and all the different maybe regulatory public services that they have to check with to make sure that everything is being done in accordance to regulations and policies. So I think that would be useful a bit to for the wider audience to understand that this is not an arbitrary procedure, but something which is very tightly controlled by the government agencies. So I see Gilles is already on the video. Gilles, maybe you want to say a few words first?
Yes, first of all, thank you for both presentations. They were very useful. I think they really brought the problematic on the table. And they were also both relatively objective. So that's also something which, as operator, we can only welcome. To have a few words on the authorization process for base stations. So first you need first what we do as operators is we define more or less a radius where we will need a new base station. This is mainly coming from two drivers. It's either the coverage needs, so that we want to increase the coverage in a certain area, or if we have the base station which are already present, if they have too many traffic and we want to offload them, then we need additional base stations to offload those, and this could be a second driver. So base stations, they are not really deployed by some kind of how do you say that? It's not pure. I mean, there is some thinking behind of where do you need a base station. It's also clear that as operator, we have also to look at the invest. We don't deploy base stations just because we like to, but there needs to be an economic driver behind. That's also for sure. So we, in summary, we only deploy base stations so we really need them. So how does it work? First, you need to have the okay of an owner. It can be a field if you want to build a tower, or it's a building owner when you want to put the base station on a rooftop. That's already quite complicated because, to be honest, it's difficult. People are very reluctant. They don't want to have base stations on the property. When you have found an owner, then there are different authorizations that you need to ask for. The first one is the building permit of the commune. This is mainly linked to urbanistic laws. So if the base station fits into the landscape, The second one is if you are building outside of an urbanized zone, so in the nature, then you need an authorization from the Ministry of Environment. This one, since a new law has been passed last year, it is quite complicated to get it. So the Ministry of Environment is trying to push base stations back to the urbanized zones, so within the zones where people are living. Then if you have that one, depending on where it is located, you might need some additional authorizations from the railroad company or the administration of Point Chaussee if it's next to a road. Depending on the height of the base station, you will need an authorization from the airport and the civil aviation. And last but not least, you need to prove to the ITM and the Administration de l'Environnement that your base station is not exceeding 3 volts per meter, as it is, like Ralph said, a recommended value in Luxembourg. It's recommended because it's not written in any law or any legal text. But at the end, the fact is, if we cannot prove that we remain below those 3 volts per meter, we won't get an authorization. So it's a recommendation, yes, but on the other hand, it's also an obligation. And these are all the authorizations that we need in order to build the base station. So now, there are several problems. Mainly, some of them are limited in time. It's often the case that you have one which is valid while you did not have the other yet, and when you get the second one, the first one is already expired. So this can happen. It's also possible that you get part of the authorizations, but for one or the other reason, you won't get the other one. So deploying a base station is a process that can take several months at least. We have projects which are ongoing since years, some of them even for more than 10 years. So yes, it's quite a complicated subject, and it's mainly coming from the fact because there is people are very reluctant when it comes to base station and electromagnetic fields in their neighborhoods. Now, what Ralph also clearly mentioned in his presentation is that most of the exposure is coming from the personal devices, so the devices itself. And then if you look at the petitions on the parliament these days, there is a petition which is asking to prohibit deployment of base stations which are closer to 200 meters to any place where people live. This is, of course, totally counterproductive in terms of reducing electromagnetic field strength. So, and that's really a problem because people are not really basing their decision on scientific facts, but it's more an emotional debate than really a rational debate. That's why these presentations are useful, and we as operator, we hope that there is a neutral source of information. So we have a huge hope on the website that will be done by the government to give some more objective information about the topic.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Jill, for your position on this. We have also the colleagues from Post. We have Jean-Paul and Thierry. I don't know if you would like to add something to that, or maybe also comment on the deployments of C-band, and what are your plans maybe also for millimeter wave in the future?
Yes, hello, this is Jean-Paul Casal from Post. So I'm in charge of the 5G program with Zone Post. So first of all, thank you for organizing this event. I think what we note frequently is that many people outside, let's say, of the direct operator area or administration area are not well informed about what is done when we deploy mobile networks, and they also very often badly understand all the aspects of the different field emissions. So for us, it is really important that we can communicate on facts, that we can here here promote also genius scientific findings, and that this will help also people to better understand. Because once people do not understand, they get unsure, and then they start also to look around to various sources. We may not always be so right. So I think we live in a world of fake news, and also for here, the mobile industry, we see the same tendency. And this can go very rapidly with all the social media that we have today. So I think we have a common task to really well inform our customers, the audience, the interested persons, so that we base our discussions on facts. I think that's something which is very important, and I think that such an event that we have today can very much contribute to this. Post has also information on its deployments and health aspects on this internet side, but I think it will be more valued by customers outside. The government is doing this because they are in a better position to do this. Now, for the deployment that you ask, I think 5G network and services will be deployed in different phases. Of course, we need for starting the right frequencies also to do that. You know that we had this year a frequency auction in Luxembourg to attribute 700 megahertz band and also 3.6 gigahertz bands. Now, these bands are not so different to what we know already today, and as was shown in the different presentations. So, be it for other mobile technologies or be it for Wi-Fi technologies. So this is not so different. No? From a deployment point of view, I think operator will first put 5G in service at the macro level. So this means that we more or less use the sites that we have. So we will not now massively build many new sites now to start the deployment. And we will look also where are the requirements of our customers, where do they want to have coverage, where do they want to have required services. And of course, we also have some coverage obligations in our license that we got from the Ministry of State that we need to fulfill. Later on, there is another frequency band that is foreseen. Here we talk then about millimeter waves, and the 26 gigahertz band is there foreseen in Europe and also in Luxembourg. And just a few days ago, there was a consultation of ILR that did finish asking different, let's say, actors here in the telecom area, what are their interests in the 26 gigahertz band. For me, this is more the second step of the deployment of 5G, when we may need more capacity or more, let's say, better coverage at some hotspots. And so this is something which will become in the coming years only as a second step. Right, so this is a small overview, so being available for other questions.
Thank you very much. I see we have a question from Hussein.
Yes, Simos, thanks. So my question is to Gilles. You said that to install some base station, the main driver will be the economical aspect. So tomorrow, if we see that having a lot of small base station, because it is more healthy, base station at what we call the femtocells or something like this, but this is not really cost effective for the operators. Is there any compromises between, let's say, healthy base station and economical aspects? Is there any, trade-off between these two aspects from point of view of operators? And the second question is about the suburban areas, so which is what you said, it is difficult to have some base station related to some regulatory reasons. And here also what I notice is that perhaps some other networks like the satellite networks can help on this part to complement the terrestrial network. So what do you think about this also? Thank you.
Okay, so for the first to the first question, I mean, clear, it's we are a private company, and first you are working for your shareholder. So I mean, it's clearly for every private company, the driver is an economic one. That's normal. If it comes to small cells, to be clear, we are not looking at it from an environmental perspective, but more from a traffic offloading perspective. So that's if it makes sense to deploy a small cell network to offload the macro network, mainly financially, then it is something that we are looking into. But at this stage, if you look at it, small cells make only sense in very dense urban regions, really metropoles like New York or really Asiatic metropoles. Luxembourg is very lightly built, and then it's at this stage we don't see any need for small cells in Luxembourg. Now, what is also worth mentioning is that the small cell network is very expensive in terms of operational cost. So you really almost have a lot of the same costs that you would have with a normal macro network, and that makes it very it's not really cost efficient. The second question, to use satellite as alternative to for suburban regions. Could be the case, but in Luxembourg, you also have, it depends on the application. In fact, let's first say clearly that we are speaking about data which is mainly used on a fixed position. In Luxembourg, you have a very good coverage of fiber. So even in suburban areas, as soon as you have fiber, in my opinion, mobile communication, also 5G, does not make a lot of sense. I mean, it doesn't make sense to compete with mobile technologies against fiber link. Fiber link is always more stable and gives better throughput. So as long as the Luxembourgish government is pushing for its broadband strategy to get Luxembourg fiberized as much as possible, this is also in line with our strategy of the company. Even if we are coming from mobile operators, that's maybe strange, but and long term, this is clearly where we need to go. Now, if you go to mobile applications and you go to more rural regions, satellite could be an alternative, but satellite always has the problem of the capacity that it could bring. Even if you take narrow beams coming from satellites, they have still a diameter of several kilometers and limited in spectrum. So you cannot bring the same capacity that you could do with terrestrial networks, that's for sure. And the second point is, if you are going to 5G and you are focusing on low latency, of course, satellites, if you don't have low Earth orbit satellites, you are always penalized by the distance. You cannot go below the physical limit. That's a fact. That's why for the Luxembourgish market, and I think even Europe-wide, I don't see a big opportunity to use satellites in data communication to mobile or fixed applications.
Okay, thanks. Because now, as you know, 3GPP, they are including satellites there. I agree with you. It depends on the use cases and depends on the area, etc. So yes, I agree with you on this point. And just for the first point, you said that, and I agree with you, that the main driver is economical aspect. But you said also that you have some difficulties to people accept to having base station, or, you know. And my question was more about to having some compromises between economical aspect and also to, you know, ensure a little bit this peoples by saying, look, we are having like small base stations, and that you know, if you have small base stations, so the radiating wave of waves will be like less reduced. And yes, so my question, as my point, it was in this direction. So at the end, you will be able to install base stations, and people also at the same time, or between bracket, it will be more healthy for people, something like this.
I think it's useful to mention that both things, economic view and the lower exposure, are not radically opposed to each other. I mean, what you should know is that the mobile traffic is doubling every 2 years. So, and this is the case since the introduction of GPRS in 2000. So every 2 years we have to transport twice of the data in the mobile network. And this brings with it that we have to densify the network. So we are deploying more and more base stations, and this also brings with it that we are reducing the power of each base station. So at the end, the electromagnetic exposure by nature is decreasing. And also Ralph mentioned that in his presentation, it makes sense to deploy more base stations to reduce the electromagnetic exposure. And the market is driving us to do that, in fact. We don't have the choice, we need to do it. So that's why I say both things are not 100% opposed to each other.
Can you hear me?
Okay. Yes, okay, thanks.
May I add something? Hello?
Yes, go ahead, Ralph.
Okay, thank you. I think it's clear that the operators have economical restrictions, but that's why there is a collaboration, the close collaboration with the government, and it's the government's role to impose the healthy restrictions. And those, on this way, all together, we come to an economical and healthy, sustainable situation. And we applied this already in the past. There was a pilot project with the city of Luxembourg, where the operators as well as government and the city were sat around the table and tried to implement with a special regard on health issues. So we applied this already in the past, and I think the collaboration and the governance view now shows that the 5G implementation will go into the same direction, taking into account as well the economical as also the healthy aspects.
Thank you, Ralph.
Thank you, Ralph. Maybe I think there's also a question from Konstantinos, but before that, maybe I would like to pose a question to the entire panel, because obviously in the audience we have also non-expert people who are working at SnT, and they are worried about how we can make sure that this is a safe working environment once we install this rooftop, right? And I was trying to get a specific speaker to talk about this from the Institut Scientifique de Service Public in Belgium. Talking with colleagues, they explained to me that this is the relevant authority that can come into a working space and make sure that there are measurements specifically at the point where people live and work to comply with the regulations. But we couldn't have him today. Probably we're going to have to organize a separate session. But I was wondering whether somebody from the panel could also address this aspect with a few words.
Well, maybe I can tell you some information on the process of getting a new base station authorized, which was already very well described by my colleagues from Proximus Luxembourg, Jules Milheims. But these aspects that you now particularly mentioned, so a safe workplace, it will be considered by the operational authorizations that we are requesting from Administration de l'Environnement and from ETM. And so we need to submit a file, a quite complete file for each new base station that we would like to build. In this file, we indicate the indication of the radio equipment that we will install, and we will also, based on a tool that is provided by authorities, do some calculations on the field exposures in the areas around the base station, and it is particularly looked at the places where people can stay. That's that they call a lieu de séjour. That's there we respect really the 3 volt per meter limit that is given. And so this is something operator need to do and submit to the administrations, which of course will then check the data, validate the data. Sometimes they request additional information for their understanding. So we do this, and only after that they then give an authorization for this particular base station. In addition to that, we have later on validation measurements that is done to have there acceptance of the site. So we have an external body, which is very often in Luxembourg, ISEP, that you mentioned, and they will go out in the field and check that also with their empirical measurements that they will do then the limits indicated in the file are respected. So this is another control that is done. What we see is that the theoretical tool from the authorities is really looking at a worst case scenario. This is also in an aspect of precaution. If we then have the measurement results of ISAP on the field, we see in really most cases we are much below the theoretical, let's say, calculated values, and the values from the worst case scenarios that were indicated there in the file. Another thing is, of course, because this is a worst case scenario, so and in real life we don't have a base station operating all the time. So this is also something then that you see that at normal times that you have really much lower feed strengths, and this is now particularly true for 5G. If you look at active antennas, of course, their communication beam is only established when there is a need of a customer somewhere at a place for communication. And so you have no continuous emission of an active antenna system. You only have, of course, a small broadcast signal, which is a very weak signal to indicate that there is some coverage, and it's only on demand that then a beam is established in a way to fulfill the requirements of the customers. So this is giving you some additional information on how we ensure that in places where people can live, and this is then an office, these are then offices here at SnT, and that these are safe places to work in.
So Jean-Paul described this very well. I just want to add one point. The worst case calculation that we are doing, in the result of this worst case calculation, we need to respect, as already mentioned, the 3 volt per meter limit, which is recommended by the government, but It is worth mentioning that this limit is more than 10 times below the international ICNIRP values. This you should keep in mind. On the other hand, what is also interesting to mention again is that most of the exposure is not coming from the base station, but mainly from the mobile devices. And if you approach the mobile device to the base station, the exposure of the mobile device will decrease. So at the end, for people which are in the building, in general, normally the exposure will be reduced. So the direct exposure, let's say. So Rolf wants to add something.
Thank you. I have to confirm, and I say Luca did it already in his speech before. From my measurements that I did for almost 20 years within the Ministry of Health, I can confirm that the indoor exposure, except a few exceptions, but it was mainly the indoor devices, personal devices, which are far above the measured values of base stations. We must not forget that we do have our recommendation of 3 volt per meter for base stations, but we don't have it in Luxembourg for any devices which come from abroad, of course. So we have the situation that the base station is more restricted than, for instance, a baby phone. And to me personally, as long as we are not going to change on this 3 volt per meter, I'm not afraid at all in the expecting of 5G. So with the 3 volt per meters that we have now as a recommendation, I think this gives me indoor and outdoor, being at home or being on the in the office, gives me security about health issues.
I have a question to Rolf. Don't you think that the 3 volt per meter is already too low, because it will have a direct consequence that the mobile phones need to transmit with higher power? You don't hear? Shall I put it in the chat? You don't hear me. Okay. Don't you think?
I accidentally the file, since I will
Okay.
not.
Don't you think that the 3 volt per meter is already too low for the base stations, because it will bring that the mobile phones need to transmit with a higher power? So the question is, would a higher power of the base station not reduce even further the direct exposure of the people using a mobile phone?
That's a good question, but I can't answer it right now. That's a problem. We are so far in models or theory, and I'm always very conservative until I have measured it on the field. So might be, I think definitely the personal device exposure is more and more getting a problem. If I see my kids spending their time on the tablets, on the phones, now with COVID, with the tablet or the social distancing, all these devices becoming more and more important. And I think that we should not only talk about base stations like it's done right now, also with the petitions that have been done in Luxembourg, or this new one about the 200 meters distance, where I'm absolutely of your opinion that this would worse the situation instead of helping it. So I think we must definitely consider also the personal exposure. When I take the bus in the morning, I have never a situation that I'm not less than 2 meters from a personal device of one of the kids or the passengers around. And that's my exposure today.
Thank you very much. I think that was very, very useful and clear answers. I think we have about 5-6 minutes left before we have to session. Are there any pressing questions? I see that Konstantinos had raised his hand. Maybe we can give the floor.
Yes, thank you very much. I will try to be very quick. Actually, maybe it's not that important. So I guess the question relates to both operators. Since Jill mentioned about the economic aspect, that the 5G economy, the infrastructure will be driven by needs of people, of course, and whether this can be, let's say, economically beneficial for the operators. But one way actually to achieve such gains, such financial gains, is actually to push for 5G, let's say, infrastructure by artificially, let's say, pushing for applications where people will be convinced that they need them. So I'm wondering actually, is this something that really the operators are looking into it, actually like promote, there are departments, let's say, promoting such kind of applications and convincing people, and if in general there is incentive actually to do this, financial incentive, so to push 5G infrastructure like that, probably by not having a flat rate for the applications, but let's say paying based on the application, so that the public actually has a choice to pay this amount, let's say, of money by choosing this application, let's say a data remining application. So is this something like, let's say, a valid way to push this? Is there any real incentive to push the 5G infrastructure like that? Thank you.
Yes, let's say it's very important that operators extend also their offer, especially with regards to 5G. We do not want to just be BitPipe, but we want to like to offer service. And of course, we are also trying to develop some applications, and based on more better services and applications, there may be an opportunity also to generate additional revenues. And this will indeed then help to increase or to improve the business case of a mobile operator. So this is something we are looking at, but in Luxembourg, particularly customers today are very spoiled with the quality of mobile services that they get, and people have a kind of attitude that driven by internet, that they need to get all this more or less for free. So it's very difficult then to change this attitude. But we try to do this in our commercial offer. If, for instance, you want to have a better latency, better service for online gaming, eventually such a customer would be ready to pay a little bit of more. So that's something we try to develop. On the other hand, we have then other maybe customer areas, industry partners, professional customers. We may be able to provide some later on the network slice with particular services for them. And so there may be also some opportunities to generate additional revenue. So yes, it's something we are looking at, but it's very hard to develop.
So also that is mainly market driven. I mean, if you want to earn money with it, there must be a demand for different applications. So it's also difficult to foresee if there is a demand or not. Another thing that you need to keep in mind, if you want to go away from the model of a flat fee and let people pay per application, you need to be careful not to violate the net neutrality of the European Commission. So we also have some restrictions on that side. As an operator, honestly, it's getting more and more complicated. You have less and less freedom. You are more and more regulated in every domain. It's not here we are mainly speaking about health and safety, but it's also the net neutrality. It's the complete security discussion on 5G, which we did not touch today, but that's at least of the same scale that the complete EMF discussion. That's where it makes it very difficult, and we as operator have less freedom to just make all the offers that we would like to.
Thank you very much, both. Thank you.
Excellent. I think that's right on time. It's about lunchtime, so the right time to stop here. I would like to thank all the participants and also the panelists very much. I think we all learned something new today, and hopefully we are going to have maybe a follow-up in the future as soon as we manage to get some additional speakers in the few coming up months. So with that, I would like again to thank you and stay safe, and hopefully we'll see each other in person soon. So bye now.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you.